All right, so we're starting with chapter 4 today. Again, I did upload videos on the YouTube channel in case you wanted to view them for kind of filling in the gaps on chapters 2 and 3. Like I said, we're really crunched for time this semester, so it's just impossible for me to cover everything in the chapter. Okay, so that's what those videos are for. Now, chapter 4. Let me see if I can make this bigger. There we go. Becoming America, 1720 to 1760. So at this point, right, we filled out almost all the 13, what we consider the 13 original colonies. Georgia is mentioned in this chapter, so it's the final one to be added on to the other 12. Most of this chapter is focusing on expansion, immigration, culture, and some conflict within colonial America. And how that seems to be changing between 1720 and 1760. In addition, you're going to see 4 imperial wars, right, before the French and Indian War. So your book has a chart about these 4 as well. We will go over them here. And the biggest kind of takeaway from that is that we have to realize that the colonies, being part of British Empire, are responsible for contributing to the war effort. And this is going to kind of push us further down the road, bit by bit, to the road for independence. Okay? So let's move on here. All right, actually, we're going to start, not there, different place. Okay, we'll start here with regional issues. So immigration to the colonies, right, was very slow to begin, and we're about 100 years after the founding of Jamestown, and close to 100 years after the initial record of selling an enslaved person, right? But as people from Europe flock to these colonies, you see them go in different places on their ethnicity or their points of origin. So in New England, right, their major form of economic activity is trade. And they have a lot of large ports up there. And you see what they call in your book a heterogeneous mixture, meaning very diverse population. So if you are not specifically, if you are coming over to an English colony and you are not English, or you are going to probably settle either in New England or the backcountry, right? Which we'll talk about the backcountry in a little bit. The Mid-Atlantic is those Chesapeake Bay colonies, right? And these are going to be largely agrarian farming, tobacco farms, and the beginnings of kind of plantation life. And those colonies have a mixture, right? They have a pretty good mix, but we're also including in those Pennsylvania, Delaware, right? All of these colonies go into the Mid-Atlantic. And so you do see a mix of population in, say, Pennsylvania. They have a very diverse population. But, say, Virginia and Maryland are mostly going to be English. Okay? And then we go into the Upper South and the Lower South. And this division is not only economic, but cultural, and does impact the amount and the treatment of enslaved people there. So the Upper South is considered, right, the Chesapeake area a little bit. You're looking at the southern part of Virginia, North Carolina, what'll later become like Tennessee, Kentucky, right? And then the Lower South, South Carolina, Georgia, what'll later become Florida, and Alabama, Mississippi, right? So the Upper South is going to be a mix of large farming, large plantations, agrarian, and business transactions and trade. Whereas the Lower South is all farming, right? You have very little city life, right? There aren't as many cities, and the culture is completely developed by the institution of slavery, right? Because they're using enslaved Africans as farm labor. Um, um, then you have the backcountry. The backcountry is pretty much anything west of the coast that has very little population. The Appalachian Mountains, and anything west of the Appalachian Mountains. Although that is even kind of. Can somebody mute their mic? We're getting a lot of rustle in there. Okay. Um, and I'm sorry, my son has a lot of opinions this morning. The backcountry, like I said, it does attract the Scotch Irish and the Scots. It also attracts immigrants from Northern Europe, Scandinavians, right? But the backcountry is really lonely and very desolate. So if you're going to go back there, you are going to be very much a pioneer and depend on your own devices. Not get hardly any support. Not going to see your neighbors all that often if you have them. And most people who go to the backcountry want to be left alone. These are not people interested in the politics of the time. No, they don't like people and they want to be left alone. So these are people kind of settle in the backcountry. Now, you also have the Spanish and the French during this time period expanding their territories, right? The French are going to officially establish New Orleans in 1718 and dominate the fur trade in the Mississippi Valley. Now, the French come to the New World with kind of different ideas about what they want to do here, especially when you look at the exploration of what's now Canada by Cartier and the St. Lawrence Riverway, right? You find that the French want to increase trade. They're here to make money, like the Dutch kind of are. They're not interested in making large colonies that are unwieldy and they have to constantly tax and keep tabs on. The French monarchy is busy, right? Fighting its own wars, mostly with the English, and having issues at home, but they do want to kind of exploit this fur trade. Now, the issue, as we know, the French are very into fashion, and the beaver has actually been completely extinct in Europe for a couple of decades now because they have hunted it to extinction. So they come to the New World, Canada, the Mississippi Valley, what's now Louisiana, which is named after King Louis. They are after trading with the Native Americans. So the French have a much better relationship with Native Americans than the English, the Spanish, or the Portuguese, by far. Okay, not perfect, right? They're no angels. They do bring Catholic missionaries to convert, but they are vastly different from the Spanish. They're not converting people at gunpoint at the end of a sword, right? These people live amongst the Native Americans. They have good trading relationships with them. They pay well for their furs that they get from the natives. They also hunt them their own, and they manage to keep treaties. Excuse me, to a certain. Now, again, that doesn't mean there's never conflicts. It just means that their relationship is much better and more cordial than any of the other Europeans that come across. And so they are dominating the Mississippi River Valley mostly through trade and a way to export goods from the north of the continent down to the Gulf of Mexico and then to the Caribbean and back to Europe. And so New Orleans, of course, is named after Orleans or Orleans in France. So again, like we have New York and New Jersey and New Orleans. And Orleans is a very wealthy, prominent region in France. And the second in line to the throne, the spare, as it were, right? You have your heir and your spare. The heir in France is called the Dauphin, and the spare is the Duke of Orleans. So very important region, hence the name New Orleans there. The Spanish are going to focus on Texas and California. They were expelled from New Mexico, that region, in 1680. It takes them years to come back. Eventually they do, and they suppress the Native Americans there. But the issue that they're going into Texas is that, as we know from the geography of Texas, it has a lot of ports, so there's a lot of coastal draw for it, right? A lot of pull factors for the coast as far as ports and its ability to trade, and its location next to Louisiana, what'll become Louisiana, but New Orleans. But inhabiting western Texas and northern Texas, they don't want to do that. They're having a hard time populating that area. But they do try to focus on Texas. They have a much better or much higher rate of population in California. The weather is not as humid. They have huge fertile valleys there, so they grow. They have a much better growing season for food, any type of food products. Whereas in Texas, it's mostly cotton, right? What'll later become the cash crop there. But these settlements are small, and most of the towns in Texas and California are famously Spanish in origin. San Antonio, Barbara, Los Angeles, right? San Francisco. These were all originally Spanish towns or missions. And San Diego, right? So you can kind of see where the names are starting to come from. But they do trade with the Native Americans, and the Spanish are getting better about their relationships. But they're starting to realize that colonizing in this part of the Americas, particularly what becomes the United States in 100 plus years, is difficult. And it's much easier to control what becomes Mexico and Central America and the Caribbean. And by that effect, it's much more profitable, right? So do we want to spend a lot of money trying to get people into these areas which don't really have a lot of resources to offer? Or do we want to make sure we focus on our resources and protecting our cash cows in the Caribbean, right? So let's move over to this. And again, this graphic is out of your textbook, but it does show kind of the migration patterns. And right, they list Africa migration, but we all know that that is enslaved Africans, forced migration, going from the western and central areas of Africa to the United States. So in 1700 to 1719, the colonies at this point, you see, right, lower numbers of everybody. But as farming takes off, 1720, 1739, right, the migration patterns, the enslaved, forced migration is the largest out of all the groups, right? So you see huge influxes and waves of enslaved people coming to the colonies, including, right, the 13 mainland colonies, to work on these agrarian areas. Again, this is against their will, though. Now, in the Caribbean and areas in Middle America and South America, the enslaved Africans are beginning to outnumber Europeans by vast numbers. Okay, you don't see that in colonies yet, and you only really will see it deep South colonies. But at this point, that isn't the case in the mainland colonies as far as overall population. But let's look at the other groups, right? We've got Germans that come in. Their big push for migration is 1740 to 1760. Ireland increases every decade. You have more and more Irish coming in. And it's important to note that under Elizabeth I, she's the second daughter of Henry VIII. She pushes for massive colonization of Ireland, right? Her Rain and her army dominate the island. They subjugate the Irish. They are cruel beyond measure. I mean, just absolutely terrible to the Irish. And so the Irish are leaving, as you can imagine. Now, why would you go to another English colony? Well, A, you've got the language already, right? Even if you do have an accent. But it's an English colony that's much further away from the crown, and you have the opportunity to own land, right? You have the ability. And so in Ireland, most of the land is already owned privately, and it's owned by English aristocracy, right? They're giving it all to English aristocracy. And it's becoming almost illegal to be Catholic, and the Irish are very Catholic, right? This is a direct insult to their culture. So they come to the New World in search of freedoms. Then you have the Scottish, which is another bluish turquoise color. The English in purple, Wales in red, but again, Wales is just the western portion of the British Isles. So it's actually just to the left on the map of England, and it's considered part of Great Britain. And then other Europeans in green. They don't list on here the Scots-Irish, which your book mentions, and that is an interesting mix. So the Scots-Irish are Scottish Presbyterians that flee to Ireland to escape English persecution. So the English have quite a reputation, as you probably already know. They have a large empire, and they tend to be very, very hostile to any type of native people that get in their way of colonization. So this is kind of the migration patterns that we're seeing there. So again, the Scots-Irish are actually Scottish people who moved to Ireland to escape English persecution, and then when the English began to do the same to the Irish, they left. They came to the New World. So migration patterns are kind of changing, and different regions attract different groups of people based on their skill set, right? Liliana, close the door. Okay, so we talked about slavery in chapter 3, but we'll talk a little bit more about it now. Again, the division of the South. The upper South, you're going to see Maryland, Virginia and Maryland, sorry. In the lower South, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And this division also dictates what not only they're growing, but their economic activity. We know South Carolina is kind of the oddball in the situation because they're mostly from Barbados, so they grow things like rice and indigo. But then you also have North Carolina and Georgia growing mostly agrarian, so large-scale agrarian economies, agriculture. And in the upper South, again, Virginia, Maryland being closer to large port cities and having been there close to the longest, with the exception of Massachusetts. So their economic activity is going to be more diverse. And so you are going to see large agrarian establishments, right? Large farming. And then you're also going to see a lot of trade going on and a lot of business transactions there. But it also kind of how they treat the enslaved people. Because the further north you go, the better enslaved people are treated. And the more likely that they are not just farm labor, right? You see more as assistants. Again, they are slaves, so let's not kind of get away from that. But you start to see them being employed as like physician's assistants and clerks and things, and you see more education in the northern or upper South. You see more freedoms to a certain extent in the upper South, and you do also have a population of free blacks in the upper South. You do have some in the lower South. You have a burgeoning population of free blacks in New Orleans, right? But Louisiana isn't part of the colonies yet, so we'll just leave that there. Resistance and rebellion, and this is often kind of a touchy subject because there's this misconception, even today, especially today, right? And certain people say that slavery was a choice. Not going to mention any names, but the enslaved people never just laid down and took it. That they never did that. Okay, there was always this knowledge and this intrinsic feeling that this is wrong and this is unjust. And so there were a variety of ways in which they resisted enslavement. Now, some people call this passive resistance, but again, there was passive resistance and there was outright rebellion and violence, right? And so in 1739, the Stono Rebellion happened, and this was it's called the Stono Rebellion because it started near the Stono River, okay? And this group of enslaved Africans were meeting there, and they took it upon themselves to rebel. They killed uh, families. They were moving towards Florida. They were actually in Georgia, I believe, and they basically killed anybody who stood in their way, and they gained supporters as they moved south, and the hope was then that they would be able to make it into Florida. At the time, again, Florida is a Spanish possession, and it has lots of Native American communities who are friendly to runaway slaves. And so they were hoping to make it to Florida where they would be protected. And the militias couldn't get them. They were unsuccessful in that. They did not make it to Florida. They were captured. There was a fight. People died fight. Resistance fighters in the Stono Rebellion died. And then pretty much all of the other slaves, whether they were leaders or just part of this, were either killed or taken to the Caribbean and sold there. But the Stono Rebellion of 1739 is just one example of a violent rebellion, right? But that isn't the only way in which they resisted. But based on the Stono Rebellion, you start to see the passage of slave codes. Slave codes are ordinances or laws put in place to control the actions of slaves and also how slaves could be treated. And the Stono Rebellion brought about a lot of fear in the South. And even though, like I said, in the Caribbean, enslaved Africans outnumbered Europeans by something like 4-1, right? But in the South, while the populations was increasing and they were getting more even, they did not outnumber the Europeans. And so the rebellion really struck fear in their hearts because they saw that as the enslaved population grew and grew and grew due to more purchasing and bringing in of enslaved people, that they could be facing a situation like the Caribbean. So slave codes started to dictate movements of slaves. In other words, even on Sunday, they couldn't go beyond their plantations a certain number of miles. Education was one of the first things that they were denied. And so you start to see kind of restrictions on that. You also see legally how you can treat or barter in slaves. And so you had certain farms that, let's say they had more enslaved people than they needed that year, they would, quote, rent out these people to their neighbors for a contract of X amount of money, whatever. But let's say something happens to this enslaved person while the neighbor is renting them, right? So there's laws about compensation, about treatment, about what to do about runaways, and etc. So running away is a form of resistance, right? Most of the time, they do try to go to Florida, or they'll go west and go into Native American tribes out there, because the Native American tribes are more likely to be friendly. than any European, right? In addition to that, you have, like I said, what we call passive resistance. So this could be slowly poisoning the master's family. This could be work slowdowns. This could be not, for example, if you're a seamstress, this could be ruining people's clothes. This could be several things, right? But we call that passive resistance. These are human beings, right? Even though the South didn't see them that way, but they have thoughts and feelings and grudges, right? Just like everybody else. And along with kind of this culture that's developing in the South, religion becomes very central to this. You have certain groups in certain areas where the enslaved Africans are Catholic, and they get this from where they're from in Africa. You also have groups of enslaved Africans that are Muslim because they were from North Africa. And of course, then there's those that convert to Protestantism or Christianity, and there's always a pushback against making them work on Sunday. And this is one of the instances in which the government sides with them, that you cannot make them work on Sunday. And so they find kind of solace in their adherence to their religion. And you also see that the extended family plays a large role in this culture, because there are times in which children are separated from their mother via sale. You also have, depending on where the enslaved person is, marriages and families they create. And in large plantations, this is encouraged, right? Because, well, in every area it's encouraged, but that the enslaved population be able to be married to one another in hopes that they will create more slaves, right? And in other parts of the South where you don't see large concentrations of enslaved Africans, you see, of course, sexual violence against female enslaved Africans in the hopes that they will bear children, and then those children inherit their slavery status from their mother. So this culture of protection develops amongst the extended family, and those who are smart, slave owners who are smart, realize that keeping families together is not only beneficial for their enslaved people, but beneficial for them. And so you see those ties there. On Sundays, oftentimes you'll see enslaved people be allowed to visit their families in other areas, other plantations, as long as you can walk there. But they're allowed to leave and come back to visit their families. All right, so let's get skipping around here. All of that is part of that. Let's move on to the Enlightenment. Sorry. All right. So the Enlightenment, as it says, is a philosophical movement. And it begins to come to the New World through wealthy Europeans or wealthy Americans at this point. So we're talking about our young Benjamin Franklins and John Locke, right? Who have spent time in Parisian salons. And salons back then were like nightclubs or lounges, right? You do have alcohol. There's various types of smoke available, whether it's tobacco or opium. And people, mostly men, would go and hang out in these salons and talk philosophy, right? And or any other things, as men do. And so this movement is really kind of amongst what you would consider elite or upper middle class, because they're the most educated. And they begin kind of fettering out this science and reason, that society should revolve around science and reason and not necessarily mysticism and religion, because you understand at this time, religion was the answer to everything. We have the Salem witch trials in the 1690s, right? There's still witch trials going on in Europe. If something is wrong, it's deemed, you look to your church leaders as to why this is happening, and they come up with an answer, right? Whereas the Enlightenment becomes kind of at odds with the religious sect of the time, because they focus on science and reason and things that you can prove. And so they're building on, the works of Galileo and the astronomy that's been coming out. They kind of look back to the classics of Greece and Rome. Excuse me. And John Locke is one of the more famous, and he writes exclusively, but his probably more famous at this time is the idea of the tabula rasa, which means a blank slate. And he's, look, when you're born, you're a blank slate. And you take on beliefs as your parents present them to you, and you are able to make your own decisions. And the idea of free will. And this is somewhat controversial, right? Because in the faith, in the church, they believe when you're born, you're already born of original sin, right? And you have to be baptized or christened. So you start to see writings coming out about political differences and the idea that divine right may not be how that works. And what I mean by divine right is that kings have long theorized, and put out this notion that God has chosen them by divine right to lead this country. And so over the last several hundred years, you see these monarchs achieve almost godlike status. They're surrounded by opulence. You have to kiss their hand. You have to bow to them. Whatever they say is the absolute law, right? And John Locke and others of his time are more reasonable about this and say, I don't know, divine right's really why. More likely because your family had money and they won a war and they won their crown, right? Or they took it over, especially the English. So they begin to challenge those notions. And absolute monarchs, especially in France, have been abusing their power. England as well, right? We went through the English Civil War. But these ideas, like we said, are not always popular, and it can be dangerous to express these ideas, right? And along this vein, you also have the famous Sir Isaac Newton, who creates calculus. Y'all can thank him for that. Laws of motion, optics, natural laws, and gravity are all kind of given credit to Sir Isaac Newton. So this is a really flowering time for education and reading and writing, logic and reason, philosophy. They're having new ideas about government, although those are kind of kept underground. Voltaire, which is he's a ghostwriter. In other words, that's not his real name. Hobbes, Locke, what was the other one? I can't remember. Hobbes writes the Leviathan, right? So there's a lot of expansion of knowledge going on this time period, 1720 to 1760. And people, quite frankly, are getting tired of all of these royally caused or sponsored violence. But the antithesis to this, right, because as you see learning expand, especially in the colonies, is that in the Puritan world or the Puritan colonies, they are upset by this. They feel like people are going astray. They're not relying on the Bible. They're not relying on God. And you have pushback of the Enlightenment, and they call this the Great Awakening. Okay, and so this is all about religion. And Jonathan Edwards, who is president of the College of New Jersey, who becomes the College of New Jersey, starts preaching, and he is a old school Puritan fire and brimstone preacher. And one of his most famous sermons is that we are all sinners in the hands of an angry God. And that if these things aren't working right, if society is in flux, if economy's going up and down, that's because you are not adhering to the teachings of the Bible. And what it really boils down to is a religious revival, right? But the actual creation of those revivals comes from the Great Awakening. So a lot of people have been to revivals, and they're usually like weekends or nights away from where you live, right? And you're supposed to be cut off kind of from the world with your congregation. And the idea is that you refocus your life on God, right? That's what the religious revival is about. And so they start to have these, and they start to take off, especially in New England, right? That we need to focus on God and become, more Christian and follow the teachings of Jesus, right? Enter a man named George Whitefield. He immigrates, and he is a traveling lay preacher, right? And what he does is he is a great speaker. In fact, he's trained in the oratory. He's trained in the theater. He spent time in the theater. So he's an amazing public speaker. In fact, we have Benjamin Franklin goes to one of his speeches. He does them all outside. And it's in a meadow, right? And Benjamin Franklin goes in there, and he's not necessarily there for the speech, but he starts measuring how far away you can be and still hear this man. And after something like close to a mile, he stops counting, right? He has this great presence, and he really kind of brings forward the Great Awakening. And people travel to see him preach. And he doesn't have a congregation. So this is a new kind of Puritan preacher. And he's not technically a Puritan, but he's just a very old school fire and brimstone preacher, right? And you begin to see this division almost in the religious elite, and they call themselves the old lights versus the new lights. And you start to see a lot of converts into these Protestant faiths. And the old lights are, like the old regime, the people from before the Great Awakening. And their criticism is that you're scaring people into conversion. And when you do that, you're not having real converts. You're having fear. You're having people who do lip service to it, thinking that otherwise, bad things could happen to them. But the new lights do a lot of good things outside of religion. They establish a lot of universities, mostly as seminary schools, in other words, to teach preachers or priests the theology and management of a congregation, etc. And so because of them, we have Brown, right? Brown University, that used to be Rhode Island College. Queens College becomes Rutgers. King's College, goodness, I think it becomes Columbia in New York. And then, of course, you have the College of New Jersey, Harvard, William and Mary. So you start to see a lot of universities, a lot of learning, a lot of education in New England that doesn't necessarily spread to the South, right? And very few universities erupt in the South. In fact, not any until after the United States is established. And even then, they're in large cities, which are few and far between in the South. So you see kind of as how we progress even into the 13 colonies, the North and the South are already kind of on divergent paths as far as economics, culture, education, right? And what's going on there. Now, the Great Awakening, as we said, not only revives religion in New England, but it does kind of provide this pushback to the Great Awakening. So you start to see kind of this eating out of thought, But what does come from this is that the at least those in New England or those in the upper colonies, the northern colonies, have a lot more freedom, not only of expression, but education. And the possibility of being educated is much more attainable in these colonies than it is necessarily in Europe. Okay, so now we're going to start on these 4 wars that lead up to the French and Indian War. Okay, and these are based on conflict in Europe, right? And they spill over into the New World. And it's the series of what they would call European wars that leads to the French and Indian War, which cause problems, okay? And mostly monetary problems. So King William's War takes place 1689 to 1697. And most of this occurs in Europe. In Europe, it's called the War of the Grand Alliance. But King William is married to Mary, right? They were the first monarchs after the Glorious Revolution, or the reason for the Glorious Revolution. William III of Great Britain and the League of Augsburg versus France under Louis XIV, right? So they're fighting the French, as always. But what are some of the ramifications? How does this affect the New World? While the British are busy fighting their European wars, they neglect their colonies. And the colonies of Canada is a colony of France at the time, and the colonies of Great Britain are left to their own devices and to their own defenses. Because as we said, as colonies, they are responsible to come into the war on the side of the mother country, right? So the British colonists capture Port Royal in Jamaica. I'm sorry, yeah, the British Navy actually does that. They capture Nova Scotia, but fail to take Quebec. Okay, Port Royal is the big win on this one, right? Because it's where the money is. So the British colonists in the northern colonies are trained and go alongside British troops to invade Canada. Okay, and they do take Nova Scotia, but then they fail to take the large trading city of Quebec. The French ally themselves with Native Americans. They attack New York, New Hampshire, what becomes Maine, but at the time is part of Massachusetts. They don't take Boston. So in or amongst all this fighting, you have colonists on both sides that are facing ongoing violence and attacks from the opposing side. And that is not good for business, right? And people are dying. This is serious warfare. And so they are not very, should we say, happy when the Treaty of Reykjavik, which was actually signed in Iceland, hence the weird name, in 1697, which basically returns everything back to the previous owners, with the exception of Port Royal, right? And so colonists don't have any say in any of the treaties, but yet they're definitely subject to the violence and or the economic disruption caused by these European wars. So again, this ends in 1697, so we're coming to the turn of the century. And as we said, King William and Queen Mary do not have children, or they don't have any that survive to adulthood. Sister Anne takes the throne in 1702, and then we have Queen Anne's War. In Europe, it's known as the War of Spanish Succession. Mainly, they are trying to shore up, at least the colonists are trying to shore up their defense around the South Carolina and New York, the New England frontier with Canada. Again, the French ally themselves with Native Americans, and Native Americans do this over and over because, as we said, the French have a much better relationship with them than any of the other European countries. But as was before in King William's War, you see a lot of violence erupting along the borders, and they are paying the price. These colonists are paying the price for issues in Europe that they have nothing to do with, right? British recapture Port Royal in 1710. Acadia or Nova Scotia becomes part of the British colonies. And then again, the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, Britain acquires Newfoundland and the Hudson Bay region from France, as well as keeping or maintaining their control over Port Royal. So Queen Anne, again, is married but does not have children that survive her. And so after that, you have transfer of power to like their cousins, who are German in origin, but the Hanoverians. And it's during Queen Anne's reign that they pass a law stating that you have to be Protestant to be monarch of Great Britain. And the main reason for this is that because right before the Glorious Revolution, when William and Mary came in and deposed her father still lives. Queen Anne's dad is still alive. He's in Rome, and his son, Charles, is very much alive. Okay, and by rights, they would be the next in line to the throne. They're Catholic. And actually, they nickname him Bonnie Prince Charlie. He leads rebellion in Scotland with the support of the Jacobeans uprising in 1745 to put him back on the throne as the rightful king of England, but he's Catholic, right? They lose. The English defeat them soundly at the Battle of Culloden, and there's no more Prince Charlie issues, right? Everybody is Protestant from then on. All right, so you have King George. Now, King George, there are three King Georges. King George the first, second, and third in succession, just like that. You have King George the First, his son is the second, and his grandson is the third. These people tend to rule reasonably well, although they are terribly cruel to their own family. Each succeeding generation has issues, psychological issues brought on by their parents. In fact, one contemporary writer of the time said that the Hanoverians would eat their young, except that their lineage would die out. I mean, they were just terrible to their children. So King George's War from 1744 to 1748, again, it's another European conflict between the French and the British. So this keeps happening over and over and over again. And the colonists are getting real sick and tired of this, right? And this one is one of the first to really fight over who's going to control North America, right? You see a lot of border raids. There's people captured, people killed, POWs taken, and a lot of news coverage in New England about all of this. And warring parties signed the Peace of La Chapelle in 1748. Again, kind of divvying up these two European countries, carving out more pieces of North America. Meanwhile, your colonists, again, left to their own devices. So what impact does this have on the relationships not only between the North American colonists of different nations, European nations, but also with their relationship between their sovereigns, right? And the next and the final war is the French and Indian War, okay? And the French and Indian War is all fought on the North American continent. It is a extension of these European wars here, but this time Europe, particularly the British, are going all out on their attempts to control North America. Okay, I'm going to stop that there, and we're going to do something else, but now is a good time to ask. I noticed a lot of you putting your names in. I can hear that. That's great. If you haven't, please do put your name in the chat for attendance purposes. Alexis Johnson, do you have a question?
Yes, ma'am. I was having questions during the lecture because I want to make sure I'm getting the information down right.
Okay.
Okay. So
What were your
my
questions?
first, one of them is education was much more attainable in what colonies specifically?
The New England colonies or the
Mm,
northern colonies.
okay. And my other question was, uh, which colonies did the King William's War cause? Which colonies the King William's War made neglectful? If that's the word. Like which colonies did he neglect in the King William's War?
Um, he neglected most of them. They were really left to
Okay.
their own devices as far as that, because most of the resources are spent defending the homeland. But let me go back here to King William's War. Um, Canada and the New England colonists are where you see most of the fighting in the colonies, with the exception of the Caribbean, because the British really,
Okay.
really want Jamaica. They want to control that sugar trade. So the border colonies between the French and the English colonies, so between Canada and New England.
Okay.
Do you have any other
And,
questions?
and you did say the Great Awakening was like a revived religion?
Yes, definitely. It was a revival in religion, and it was a revival in really literal interpretations of the Bible, Protestantism, so like Puritanism, and just a real strict interpretation of the Bible, right?
Awesome. Thank you.
hmm Did anybody else have any questions? Let me see. Okay, so what we are going to do, as far as, let me make some announcements and we can ask questions at this point before we move on. If y'all have any questions over the from over the weekend. So the issue about MindTap is that we are going to open it back up for a 24-hour period, and it will be the week of the midterm. So I will look at that date because I want to make sure that they sorry, I'm trying to do about a million things at the same time. The midterm assignment isn't due on the same day that the MindTap is opened up. So what I'll do is get you a date here real quick. Looking at the syllabus, and midterms coming up. You think? Let's see. Midterm assignment is due October 2nd, which means that is the week considered the week of midterm. So that's September 27th through October 3rd. What I will probably do is have MindTap chapters 1 through 7 open on Saturday the 3rd. Right? So those of you that missed the chapters 1 and 2, you'll have that opportunity to upload that. I'm sorry, to access those again for that 24-hour period. I'm sorry, let me go back here. Are there any other questions about MindTap, plagiarism quiz, anything upcoming?
I have a question, ma'am. I sent
Yes.
you an email talking
Uh-huh.
about what happened with my chapter 1. I didn't got a response, so I don't know what happened.
Okay. Did you send it this morning?
No, I sent it Friday. No,
Okay.
Thursday. For your last. Yeah, I sent it Thursday.
Yeah, I sent a response. You just didn't get it. And again, that's probably the IT having an issue. But
Yeah,
I'll
that's
send
fine.
you a message through Blackboard. Okay.
Okay, that's great.
Let me write that down. Hold on real quick. I don't want to forget. Anybody else? Questions, issues from the
Chapter 4 is
weekend?
due this week.
Yes, chapter 4 is due this week.
And you have something on the document analysis on YouTube.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, I do. An instruction video.
Excuse me, Professor. I got a question.
Yes, yes.
I was waiting on you to respond back to my email last night.
Okay. I responded to everybody. Okay, but as I said in that announcement, I don't think everybody's getting it, obviously, right? Because y'all are not getting my responses. So what I can do is if you message me in Blackboard, I'll try and respond through there. And what's my YouTube? The link is on Blackboard under the Getting Started folder, which is under syllabus.
Okay, and
Okay.
you was mentioning about the email. I don't think my email had anything to do with that because I been had the same gauge. I been had that I had that last semester. That didn't have nothing to do with it. So I'm not sure what's the problem, but I hope this don't affect my grade.
Okay, well, like I said, I can't. I don't want to discuss it right in class in front of everybody. But B, I don't know right offhand what your issue was. So I will respond to you. Send me a message in Blackboard, and I will get in there and look for that and see what there is there. Actually, let me do this. Okay, on the link there. Yeah, so I'm going to have to try and use Blackboard too, so that I make sure that you guys are getting those responses. One thing I will say, okay, for Cengage, go through Blackboard, that'll automatically link to your class, and make sure that you're using your TigerMail email when you set up your Cengage account, because that's how it links through Blackboard. So if the issue is you're doing stuff in Cengage and you have grades in there, but they're not transferring over to Blackboard, that could be the problem. But either way, I'll respond to your issues there. Libyanka, you have a question?
No, you already answered my question. Sorry.
Okay. Kaylee? Sorry.
Yes, sorry, when you were talking about the mind taps like opening back up, I missed chapter 3. So I was just wondering about that.
Yep, they're all going to open back up on the 3rd.
Okay. On the
Chapters
3rd.
1
Okay,
through
thank
7. Yep. Chapters 1 through 7 will be open for that 24-hour period. I'll make an announcement. I'm sure we're going to talk about it probably 100 times between now and then. But yeah, that's what I'm going to do so that we can address that issue, right? And that's kind of what we decided over the weekend as a department, that we're all going to kind of handle this individually as to, allowing people to make them up. So,
Ma'am, I have a question.
Yes. I will have
So
an answer.
are we supposed to do chapter 4 quiz this week in MindTap?
This week, yes. Chapter 4, chapter tests.
What day is that due?
Saturday, I believe. Saturday
Okay.
by midnight. Let me double check that for you. Where are we? Still on the midterm thing. It'll say on MindTap, by the way. When you open it up, it'll tell you when it's due. Chapter 4 is due September 12th. So, what day is that? Is Saturday. Okay. Any other questions, concerns? Okay. We will have the in-class discussion this week. So you need to be reading chapter 4. And we talked about MindTap chapter 4 being due, MindTap reopening. So in-class discussion, and chapter 4 is what you need to make sure you get done this week. Yes, Isaac?
No.
Isaac Garcia?
Yeah, I just asked the question
Oh,
about the chapter
okay.
4.
All right. Let me lower your hand because it popped up as you had a question. All right. Anybody else? Let me Jalacia?
Are we having classes online or face to face?
Online.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, our class will be online all semester. Um, y'all are moving in this weekend, right? Is that what I saw on the emails?
Some people are.
Some people are. Okay. So in situations like this, right, COVID's not over, and if we get into the full swing, people are living in the dorms, some classes are meeting face to face, and there's an outbreak of COVID. The biggest thing I need you to do is just keep me informed of what's happening to you. If you are quarantined, if you were exposed, etc., shoot me an email or a message through Blackboard and let me know. Okay. If you end up getting tested positive again, you don't have to give me medical details, right? That's a HIPAA violation. I'm not asking you for that, and you don't have to give that to me. But I do need to know, like your status as it relates to this class. Hey, I'm in quarantine, or I'm going to be, on bed rest, or I'm going to be offline for a while. You need to let me know that. As far as COVID is related. Also, there's a lot of resources on campus. So if you need any of that, email me or send me a message through Blackboard. Okay. Ms. Lee, did you have another question?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Because I think there's like a time delay because I'm seeing you guys raise your hands after you've already asked your question. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to go over a video again. We'll stop, talk, and the video is on YouTube, so you can view it if you need again. Okay, and sorry, hold on. It opened in a different window, so let me share that window for you. All right. Well, gross.
Few Americans in the 1750s are bothered by their connection to the British Empire. After all, it provides opportunities for trade and commerce, as well as military protection and political stability. And for the most part, the English government leaves the colonies alone.
When one tries to understand the build-up to the American Revolution, I think it's absolutely crucial to think of this not so much in terms of right and wrong, and more in terms of increasingly divergent conceptions and expectations of what the imperial relationship will be like.
I think the British Empire between the late 17th century and the 1760s really did evolve into a working federal state, that is, with a very significant division of power and authority between the central state and the participating colonies. And it was one that worked quite well, but never had any sort of sustaining ideology or legal apparatus that could explain why power should be divided the way it was. One discovers that there are very different assumptions behind the way Parliament's behaving and the way the colonists are behaving.
The colonists increasingly see themselves as equal to the mother country. They become increasingly self-confident. Benjamin Franklin's expectation that at some point population growth in the colonies would dictate that the capital of the British Empire be shifted to North America is, I think, a sign of just how self-confident colonists were becoming about the place where they lived. The imperial authorities, on the other hand, assumed that the colonies were very much inferior, that the government in London had the right to dictate law and policy and taxation. The fact that they hadn't exercised this power very much during the first half of the 18th century didn't in any way take away from the fact that they thought they had that power.
You can go all the way back to the 1630s and find Englishmen who are saying, we've got to watch these colonies. They may just set up on their own one of these days. You hardly ever find somebody who's born in the colonies who has fantasies of an independent America.
In many respects, the colonists feel stronger ties to England than to each other. They rarely work together, even when threatened by a common enemy, the French and their Indian allies.
The Ohio Valley in the 18th century is the area in which you have strong Indian confederacies, you have the French, and you have the British. And the French are primarily interested in fur trade. The English want to expand, they want to engross the land, take it over, get people on it. New France is quite underpopulated compared to British America. They are interested in happy relations with the Indians, who are their partners in trade. So the French and the English have different interests. For much of the 18th century, different Indian groups were quite adroit in playing the French and the English off against each other, in extracting concessions from them, allying with one side or the other, or withholding alliance at different times in order to extract concessions. So there is a kind of balance of power among all three of these groups in the Ohio Valley until really the 1750s.
It is in 1754 that the long-standing struggle between France and England erupts in the 7 Years' War.
It breaks out when young Colonel George Washington of Virginia, who'd been a surveyor, went out to tell the French not to try and build a fort there. The French wouldn't listen to him, so he came back again. The French by then were building Fort Duquesne at what's now Pittsburgh. Washington found out there was a French patrol near him. He attacked the patrol, wiped most of it out, was shocked when one of his Indian allies basically tomahawked to death the French commander of that expedition. And the French then retaliated and forced Washington to surrender, but allowed him to march back to Virginia. So his first military encounter is A, not at all successful, and secondly, he starts a world war.
At first, the war is fairly contained. But in 1756, it explodes into a conflict of international proportions.
After William Pitt becomes the war minister in 1757, they do decide to make North America their main theater of operations, which hadn't been true in earlier struggles between France and Britain.
So that was a new policy by the British Empire, to send ships and men and munitions and money as never before to North America, and to make their prime goal the conquest of Canada. And so the colonists found themselves suddenly host to very large numbers of British troops and British sailors, an infusion of a lot of British money being spent in their colonies. It brought the colonists and British officials and British officers together as never before on a much larger scale. And they didn't always like what they saw in one another.
Choruses of demands coming out of British officials in the middle 1750s. So Parliament's got to tax the colonies, and Benjamin Franklin tells them, don't do it, bad idea. Instead, Pitt comes up with something they tried briefly in the previous war, a subsidy system, which is by no means paying for all the expenses the colonies are at for this war. But he sets aside a fixed amount of money. For the first several years, it's £200,000, and then it's £133,000. The colony governments can divide up this money in direct proportion to how much you contribute to this year's war effort. And the result is the colonies pay for over half the cost of their own military effort.
For the first time, the colonists find themselves working together against a common foe.
Certainly New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania after about 1756, and all the New England colonies are very much into this war effort. I don't know that anybody's ever really calculated this, but my guess would be that there are about 60,000 armed Anglo-Americans who are closing in on New France, which has only 75,000 people in it. And that is what leads to the conquest of New France by 1760. And it really is decisive. It really does change the face of North America.
What role does Spain, the other major power on the North American continent, play in this conflict?
Usually Spain and France had been allies in these wars against Britain. Spain decided to remain neutral in the 7 Years' War. And for bizarre reasons. What we're beginning to learn is they're afraid of the British. They're also afraid of the French. So Spain decided to sit this one out until about early 1762, after the fall of New France, after the French have lost their major sugar islands. So the British just turned their juggernaut against the Spanish and take Havana and take Manila in the Philippines. And finally, the Spanish say, let's make peace. And they do make peace. And actually, in order to get Havana back, they turn Florida over to the British.
By the end of the war, British holdings in North America have changed dramatically.
They picked up half of Louisiana. They got the half that was on the eastern bank of the Mississippi, whereas the French gave the western half of Louisiana to their Spanish allies as a consolation prize for having fought with them and lost. The British got everything east of the Mississippi. Given huge amounts of manpower, they had made financial contributions. They felt that they had earned an equal place within the empire.
Again, if you look at Pitt's subsidy system, what's now 133,000 pounds a year, the British, after the war, spending over 400,000 pounds a year on the British Army and artillery and Indian presence. 133 would have been something of a bargain, it seems to me. And it would have encouraged the colonists to participate actively and voluntarily in this system. Instead, they demobilize all of the provincials, decide to run the West only with the British Army. I think they have very good intentions in all of this. One, they assumed that the settlers would antagonize the Indians sooner rather than later. What they didn't realize was that the army was already doing that. And the British provoked this massive Indian resistance, Pontiac's War, 1762-64, in which almost every British garrison in the West is overrun in 1763. The big exceptions were Detroit and Niagara and Fort Pitt, and they all did manage to hold out.
Primarily, the Indians object to traders and settlers moving on to lands they consider their own. The British government attempted to control the situation by issuing the Proclamation of 1763, forbidding settlers from advancing to territory west of the Appalachian Mountains.
It didn't actually stop people getting up and going. If you wanted to go out there and take up squatters' rights, you could do it, and a lot of people did. And in fact, a lot of people did so in order to leave behind various debts or bad marriages. Daniel Boone, who becomes famous as the founder of Kentucky, was fleeing a sheriff's warrant for debt in Virginia. The sheriff's subpoena says, gone to Kentucky, to Kentucky. So actual people going over the mountains did stop. What the proclamation did do, however, and this bothered the planters a lot, was invalidate any potential land titles so that you could not open up land legally and have a valid claim to it, which meant that you couldn't develop that land.
Their attempt after 1763 were to station agents and supervisors of the Indian territories to manage settlement in a controlled way, to keep antagonisms with the natives from building up, and in general, to assure a tranquil life there so that they wouldn't have wars to fight in the borderland. And on the whole, they failed. I mean, there was constant uproar in these areas. British government, in a time period in which they were trying to exert many different kinds of control over North America, political and economic, as well as control of the territories, were failing to maintain control over the newly opened lands.
It is in part to pay for the cost of administering this new continental empire that the British begin enacting a series of financial revenue acts in 1764.
Because you're growing rapidly, your population doubles every generation. Eventually, you should be able to pay all the cost of your defense. But for now, let's just start with the Sugar Act, which is mostly a tax on molasses coming from the French islands, and the Stamp Tax, Stamp Act of 1765, which is mostly a tax on legal documents, almost self-enforcing because the acts of these will get no legal force whatever unless they are printed on stamped paper.
As to the Stamp Act, the first bad consequences attending it I take to be this: our courts of judicature must inevitably be shut up, for it is impossible, or next of kin to it under our present circumstances, that the Act of Parliament can be complied with, were we ever so willing to enforce the execution. For not to say, which alone would be sufficient, that we have not money to pay the stamps, I fancy the merchants of Great Britain trading to the colonies will not be among the last to wish for a repeal of it.
And the question was, well, does Parliament have the authority to do all of this? And Parliament said, well, we don't see any difference between passing the Navigation Acts back in the 17th century and passing the Sugar Act tax or the Stamp Act tax today. And the colonists are saying, no, there's got to be some distinction, what Parliament can do and what Parliament can't do. But on the whole, they'll concede the power of Parliament to regulate their trade. But they do increasingly say, you can't tax us for revenue.
One reason the British were so baffled by the Americans' behavior was this was people not at all oppressed. They were much less heavily taxed than the British, than people living in Britain were. They had their own self-government. They had considerable leeway in all kinds of ways. The colonial assemblies had a great deal of power and indeed seemed to have gained in power over the course of the 18th century. And Americans, so when they looked at the Americans, they thought, what are these people complaining about? They've got everything they could want. And even the Americans thought that to a surprising degree.
The series of crises that marked the 1760s eventually subside, not because of resolutions by colonial assemblies or riots in American cities, but because economic pressures force England to back down.
The northern colonies, it appears, are endeavoring to adopt this scheme. In my opinion, it is a good one, provided that it can be carried pretty generally into execution. If the gentlemen in their several counties would be at some pains to explain matters to the people, and stimulate them to a cordial agreement to purchase none but certain enumerated articles out of any of the stores after such a period, not import nor purchase any themselves. This, if it did...
The movement to boycott British goods could bring together people for very different reasons. The Virginia planters supported the boycott because here was an excuse not to spend lots of money they didn't have without surrendering the appearance of wealth and gentility. In Massachusetts, in New England, generally, also the boycott was widely supported. But there was a strong impetus, a strong motivation grounded in a kind of moral reformation. If Britain was given over to luxury and vice and laziness and corruption, Americans could be self-sacrificing, frugal, lean and mean in a way. And so here we have support for the boycott for very different reasons.
One of the ways of looking at the revolution is to see Great Britain embarking on what is ultimately a self-fulfilling, not just prophecy, but nightmare. Almost everything that they're doing after 1763 is driving the colonists to a position where the colonists were not going on their own.
There was a concerted effort to get rid of the duties that were imposed by, called the Townsend duties at the end of the 60s, in which, again, brought people together in committees that became consolidated within certain provinces and then became trans-provincial and finally continental size. But the basic force that was at work through these years was a buildup of apprehension, of fear, that they were being subjected to a familiar kind of political pressure, which would end in the destruction of what they prided themselves on as British liberties. And the way the British government managed these apprehensions, or rather failed to, is one of the key elements in this whole history.
There's one crisis after another. The British take one action, the Americans see it in a certain way. The British pull back a little bit. Then they try something else a couple of years later. The Americans are outraged by that. And every one is one more nail in the faith that Americans have in this particular British ministry, in this particular British crown.
An event in Boston ignites colonial resentment to a new level of intensity.
It's a clash between really working class people in the city of Boston and one of the bodies of British troops that had been brought in to keep order in what had become one of the most disorderly of the American cities in the colonies. A group of workmen, and there were a sizable number of blacks and mulattoes, mixed bloods, people that were black with some blood, confront the body of British troops and begin to taunt them for attacking and taking away the liberties of Americans who should be treated like free Englishmen. And it leads to a riot and a clash in which the British troops fire on this group of what they will see as rabble. And they will kill people who were either slaves or runaway slaves or recently freed blacks, along with whites. And African Americans from that moment will say that they were participants at the beginning of that struggle for liberty. Crispus Attucks, a mulatto, who was one of probably the rowdiest of the workmen, is among the first to die. And blacks will claim that they shed some of the earliest blood in what now begins to be the fight for freedom from Great Britain.
Although the next 3 years appear relatively calm, growing resistance simmers just below the surface.
When they saw things like the stationing of troops in a peaceful area such as happened in Boston in 1768, when they saw a very small episode but which became in their minds very aggravated, what is thought of as the Boston Massacre, where 5 people were shot by the troops, where they saw customs officers clamping down control that hadn't been there before, where they saw controls of the judicial system that hadn't been there before, where they saw courts were being transplanted to different areas in order to keep away from the pressure of local political groups. When they saw many things of this kind building up over the years, it fitted a pattern of what they considered to be tyranny in free states. And the buildup of opposition was initially slow, but it grew in ways that became more and more consolidated.
This was a more diversified society, and a society that was, in fact, had significant groups that were not culturally identified with England. The Scots-Irish didn't like the English. The Germans clearly were not identified with the English. So those are forms of divergence. Another problem that arises in the way in which Americans thought about themselves is the very dynamism and growth of the American economy and American society. There were aspects of British society and culture that were no longer good fits with the American colonies. The fact that the American economy and population were growing so quickly and dynamically meant that it was no longer so easily corralled within the British economic system, and that the Navigation Acts or the mercantilist policies, the customs regulations, all of these things they pinch more and more as the American colonies grow.
What is it we are contending against? Is it against paying the duty of 3 pence per pound on tea because burdensome? No. It is the right only we have all along to. I think the Parliament of Great Britain hath no more right to put their hands into my pocket without my consent then I have to put my hands into yours for money. And this being already urged to them in a firm but decent manner by all the colonies, what reason is there to expect anything from their justice?
To jump ahead to 1774, after the Bostonians, rather than pay the tax on tea, they dumped these 340 plus chests of tea into Boston Harbor.
Okay, let's go ahead and stop there. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and I will see you on Thursday.
We doing a discussion in class Thursday?
Correct. Yes.
All right.
Professor,
Yes.
so is all the teachers coming back, or is it select few?
It depends on the situation of your class. So on your schedule, there's like 4 different types of classes. There's strictly online. There's our class, which is called synchronous online, where we're online, but we have specific meeting times. Then there's face-to-face, and there's hybrid. So the way to figure out which class is which is to look on your schedule and look down where it says location. If you have a building and a room number there, then yeah, you're going to start meeting in class next week.
Okay.
Okay? If you have just a time there, and it should say next to it like synchronous online, but a time, then that's like our class.
Okay.
Okay? My suggestion would be if you have a question, email the professor.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.